When my mother calmly announced she was suing me for the house worth $500,000 that I rebuilt from ruins, I did not shed a single tear. I just quietly slid my phone across the desk toward my lawyer. For 30 years, I was the silent, invisible stepping stone for my golden sister. But as my lawyer gave a sharp laugh that shattered my parents' arrogant confidence, I knew my era of submission was finally over. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Tessa Cruz. The air inside the downtown corner office of Veronica Hayes, attorney at law, was suffocatingly thick, smelling of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and the faint, crisp scent of freshly printed legal documents. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved in a silent, gray blur, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside this room. I sat perfectly still in a high-backed chair, my calloused hands resting quietly on my lap, staring blankly at the sleek silver conference phone sitting in the center of the massive glass desk. My mother's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and grating, devoid of any maternal warmth. "Tessa, you are being completely unreasonable. We are a family, and families help each other. Morgan needs this capital. She is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. You are going to sign over the deed to the property by Friday, or your father and I will take you to court. We will sue you for everything you have. We are talking about a $500,000 asset that should belong to this family, not just you." My father chimed in immediately after, his tone heavy with a practiced, arrogant authority. "Do not be selfish, Tessa. Your sister is meant for great things. A house is just a house. You can always rent an apartment somewhere else." They spoke of it as if it were a hand-me-down sweater, a trivial object I was hoarding out of pure spite. They had absolutely no concept of what that building actually was. They did not know the blood, the sweat, and the solitary tears woven into every single square inch of its foundation. For 30 years, I had been the silent, invisible stepping stone for my sister. But their demand today crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I am a historic architectural restoration specialist. For over a decade, I have worked for Ironclad Preservation Works, a private firm dedicated to pulling forgotten pieces of history back from the brink of demolition. My days are spent breathing in centuries-old dust, analyzing load-bearing masonry, and coaxing life back into structures that the modern world has deemed worthless. I have spent my entire adult life fixing broken things. 3 years ago, I found the listing. It was an abandoned 19th-century firehouse sitting on the forgotten outskirts of Blackwood, Virginia. The roof was caving in, the windows were shattered, and the interior had been surrendered to rot and wild ivy. The town wanted to bulldoze it. I bought it for practically nothing. To the rest of the world, it was a terrifying eyesore. To me, it was a masterpiece waiting to be uncovered. I poured every ounce of my soul and every single cent of my savings into that firehouse. I spent my days working at the firm and my nights laboring under the harsh glare of halogen work lights. I spent 8 months just digging out and reinforcing the crumbling stone foundation, hauling away wheelbarrows of heavy debris until my back ached and my hands were raw and bleeding. When the structural integrity was finally secure, I moved on to the aesthetic bones. I painstakingly scrubbed and restored thousands of antique-fired bricks one by one, using specialized brushes to remove decades of soot without destroying the historical patina. I personally gutted the rusted toxic pipes and rewired the entire electrical system, snaking miles of fresh copper through thick, stubborn plaster walls. For 3 long years, I did not take a single vacation. I did not buy new clothes. My meals consisted of cheap takeout eaten on overturned paint buckets in the freezing cold. But slowly, the ruins gave way to resurrection. The gaping holes became massive, custom-arched windows that flooded the open-concept living space with golden afternoon light. The cracked concrete floor was polished to a deep, mirror-like finish. I turned a pile of forgotten 19th-century rubble into a breathtaking, one-of-a-kind home. It was my sanctuary. It was the only thing in my life that I had built entirely for myself. And because of my profession, I treated my own home exactly like an ironclad preservation site. It was an obsessive, deeply ingrained habit. I kept every single piece of paper, every hardware store receipt, every municipal building permit, every contractor invoice, and every approved architectural blueprint was carefully cataloged. I took thousands of time-stamped photographs documenting the progress from the first swing of the sledgehammer to the final coat of sealant. 3 massive, heavily organized binders sat neatly on my bookshelf at home, detailing every penny and every hour of labor I had invested. I did it out of professional pride, never once realizing that this meticulous paper trail would eventually become my ultimate weapon. The speakerphone buzzed again, my mother's voice growing frantic and impatient. "Tessa, did you hear me? We are not asking. We are telling you. Sign the deed, or prepare for a legal battle you cannot afford." I did not answer. I simply reached forward and pressed the glowing red button on the console, cutting off her shrill voice mid-sentence. Silence flooded the luxurious office, ringing in my ears like a sweet melody. I looked across the desk at Veronica Hayes. She was leaning back in her designer chair, her manicured fingers steepled under her chin. She was not intimidated by their threats. In fact, her eyes were gleaming with a dangerous, predatory amusement. She picked up her gold pen, twirled it slowly between her fingers, and let out a soft, sharp laugh. "Tessa," Veronica said, a wicked smirk spreading across her face. "Let me teach them a lesson in real estate law and greed." My sister Morgan was 26 years old, but she moved through the world with the unchecked entitlement of a toddler wearing a plastic crown. To the outside world, and certainly on her heavily curated social media profiles, she was a fierce tech entrepreneur, a visionary breaking glass ceilings. The reality was a poorly kept secret that my parents, Arthur and Eleanor, guarded with their lives. Morgan had already driven 3 separate startup ventures into total bankruptcy. Yet, she resided in a luxury downtown penthouse, a breathtaking space with floor-to-ceiling windows and imported Italian marble, quietly subsidized by my parents' checking accounts. Arthur and Eleanor worshipped at the altar of public perception. They measured a person's worth by the brand of their car and the exclusivity of their zip code. In their meticulously crafted family portrait, Morgan was the glittering centerpiece, the genius innovator who was always just one pitch meeting away from making the cover of a major business magazine. And me? I was the embarrassing smudge in the background. While they threw lavish networking dinners to celebrate Morgan's imaginary milestones, they only called me when they needed a free plumber, an emergency cleaner, or someone to fix the structural rot on their summer patio. I was the hired help they did not have to pay. Oddly enough, I had long ago stopped harboring any burning resentment about this dynamic. Favoritism in our family was not a sudden explosion. It was a chronic, wasting disease that I had simply learned to live around. I chose the path of total independence. I maintained a safe, heavily fortified emotional distance, preferring the quiet dignity of my own isolated life. When I looked down at my hands, rough and calloused from years of masonry and manual labor, I did not feel shame. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. These hands had built my reality. Morgan's hands, perfectly manicured and soft, had only ever built illusions. The fragile ecosystem of our family shattered on the night of my first Christmas party in the renovated firehouse. It was late December. I had foolishly invited them, wanting to share the warmth of the massive stone fireplace I had built stone by stone. My parents spent the evening offering backhanded compliments about the exposed brick, suggesting it looked a bit too industrial, a bit too unfinished for polite society. Morgan, however, spent the evening aggressively depleting my expensive wine supply. By 10 o'clock, she was flushed, swaying slightly in her designer heels, and holding court near the kitchen island. She swirled her wine glass, leaning heavily against the pristine marble countertop I had installed myself. "To big moves," Morgan slurred, raising her glass to the few remaining guests. "Next year is going to be explosive. I am officially securing a massive angel loan for my fourth company. The beta testing is going to revolutionize the fitness app market. We are talking high-level venture capital people." My mother beamed, clapping her hands together. "Oh, Morgan, sweetheart, we are just so incredibly proud of your vision." I was wiping down a nearby table, half listening to the familiar delusion, when Morgan suddenly turned her glassy eyes toward me. She giggled, a sharp, uncoordinated sound that cut through the low jazz playing in the background. "And honestly," Morgan announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings, "I have to give a huge shout-out to my big sister. I could not have secured this tier of funding without riding on Tessa's excellent credit profile. So cheers to the boring sister who pays her bills on time." The room went entirely still. The rag in my hand froze against the wood. My father abruptly coughed, his face draining of color, while my mother forcefully grabbed Morgan's arm, her perfectly painted nails digging into my sister's skin. "Morgan is just drunk," my mother said loudly, her voice pitched an octave too high. "She is talking absolute nonsense. Time to go home, sweetie." They practically dragged her out of the front door within 2 minutes, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood alone in the center of my great room. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt like freezing wind against my skin. My intuition, usually quiet and steady, began screaming a frantic warning. Morgan was sloppy, but she was not inventive. She lacked the imagination to lie about something so specific. My mind violently scrolled back through the years, stopping dead on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. I had just bought the firehouse. My parents had invited me to a rare lunch, putting on a miserable performance of financial panic. My father had claimed his business was facing a temporary, devastating liquidity crisis due to a corrupt contractor. He begged me to sign what he called minor guarantor papers, insisting it was just a bureaucratic formality to help them secure a short-term bridge loan to save the family home. He swore it would be completely cleared in 6 months. I was exhausted, stressed about my own new mortgage, and foolishly susceptible to my father's manufactured tears. I signed the documents. I never looked at the fine print. I never followed up. That night, after the last guest had departed and the fire had died down to glowing embers, I did not go to sleep. I sat at my heavy oak dining table, the only light coming from the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen. The quiet sanctuary of my home now felt like a crime scene waiting to be uncovered. I pulled up my banking portals, requesting copies of my full, unredacted credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. I stared at the loading screen, my chest tight, a cold, calculated suspicion solidifying in my veins. The puzzle pieces were falling into a horrifying formation. The minor papers, Morgan's endless luxury lifestyle, my parents' sudden desperate demand for my home, and the drunken confession. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I might be the unwitting foundation upon which their entire empire of lies had been built, and I was going to tear it down. The morning after my Christmas party, I did not go to work. Instead, I drove my truck to a nondescript office park on the gray industrial edge of the city. I was there to meet Marcus Thorne. Marcus was not your cinematic, trench-coat-wearing private eye. He was a former forensic accountant for the federal government, a man who spent his life exclusively uncovering white-collar financial crimes. I sat in his Spartan office, handed him a cashier's check for a retainer fee of $5,000, gave him my social security number, and told him to dig into the deepest, darkest corners of my family's financial history. For 3 agonizing weeks, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I went to my restoration sites, mechanically directing my crew, laying historical bricks, and mixing mortar, but my mind was completely consumed by a chilling dread. Every time my phone rang, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I could not sleep. I paced the polished concrete floors of my firehouse, playing my parents' words over and over in my head. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Marcus called. He asked me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, he did not greet me with a smile or offer me a cup of coffee. He simply pushed a massive, 3-inch thick manila folder across his cold metal desk. His face was grim, etched with the kind of professional disgust that only comes from witnessing the absolute worst of human nature. "Tessa," Marcus began, his voice gravelly and low, "I have tracked offshore accounts, busted corporate embezzlement rings, and audited corrupt politicians. But what your parents have done to you is one of the most brazen, systematic familial frauds I have ever seen in my entire career." I opened the heavy folder. The very first page was a copy of a dense legal document I had never seen before in my life. "That is a durable power of attorney," Marcus explained, pointing a thick finger to a signature at the bottom of the page. "It gives your father total, unchecked legal authority over your entire financial life. It is a spectacular forgery. They likely executed this right after you signed those minor guarantor papers 3 years ago. They either slipped this page into that stack, or they copied your signature perfectly." My stomach plummeted. He flipped the page to reveal a thick stack of banking statements. "There is no angel investor for Morgan," Marcus stated flatly. "There never was. For the last 36 months, your parents have been funding your sister's spectacular business failures and her luxury downtown penthouse by bleeding your identity dry. They used that forged power of attorney to open 7 different high-limit corporate credit cards in your name. They took out secret, high-interest secondary mortgages against properties they do not even own outright, listing you as the primary guarantor." I stared blindly at the endless rows of numbers. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, all registered under my name. My pristine credit score, carefully built over a decade of frugal living and grueling physical labor, had been the golden goose they had secretly slaughtered to feed Morgan's grandiose delusions. "But that is not the worst part," Marcus said softly, his tone shifting from clinical to sympathetic. He pulled out a separate, smaller file tied with a red string. "I dug deep into your family's probate records. Do you remember your Aunt Beatrice?" My breath hitched sharply in my throat. Aunt Beatrice was my father's estranged sister. She was the only person in my entire childhood who ever looked at me and saw someone of actual value, not just a disposable tool to serve the golden child. She died 5 years ago, and I had mourned her entirely alone. "When Beatrice passed away," Marcus continued, watching my face carefully, "she left a trust fund specifically designated for you. It was meant to be transferred to your control on your 25th birthday. The total sum of the trust was exactly $300,000. The dimly lit room started to spin. The air was suddenly too thin to breathe. "I never knew," I whispered, the words scraping painfully against my throat. "Nobody ever told me." "Because they stole it," Marcus stated, delivering the final fatal blow. "Using that same fraudulent power of attorney, your parents diverted the entire trust into a dummy holding company. Over the span of 48 months, they systematically drained every single penny of that $300,000. They used your inheritance to maintain Morgan's fake entrepreneurial empire and to fund their own lavish country club lifestyle. Aunt Beatrice tried to give you a solid foundation, Tessa. Your parents took a sledgehammer to it and used the pieces to build a palace for your sister." The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, creating a picture so grotesque I wanted to vomit. I looked down at the mountain of debt statements and then back up at the investigator. "The lawsuit," I muttered, my voice trembling as the realization hit me. The sudden demand for my house, It is not about securing an investment for Morgan at all. Exactly, Marcus nodded, leaning forward over the desk. This entire house of cards they built is finally collapsing. The corporate credit cards are completely maxed out. The secondary lenders are threatening to call in the loans. Your parents are currently drowning in over $400,000 of toxic debt that is legally tied directly to your name. They are desperate. They need your restored firehouse. They intend to seize it, liquidate the property for $500,000, and use the cash to quietly wipe out the fraudulent debts before the banks realize what is going on. They are trying to bury the evidence of their federal crimes by stealing the only thing you have left. For a blinding, breathless moment, my entire world collapsed. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal ripped through my chest like a physical blade. My own flesh and blood had sold me out, robbed my inheritance, and were now plotting to steal my sanctuary to cover their criminal tracks. My vision blurred. I put my head down on the cold metal desk, my rough hands gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned a violent shade of white. I allowed myself exactly 2 minutes of weakness. 2 minutes to mourn the parents I thought I had, the aunt I missed, and the family I was never going to get. When I finally lifted my head, the tears were completely gone. The agonizing confusion had evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. It was a dark, icy clarity that settled deep into my bones, freezing over any remaining trace of daughterly affection. I was a master restoration expert. I knew exactly how to tear down a rotting, structurally compromised building without causing collateral damage. I gathered the thick stacks of paper, aligning the edges perfectly before placing them back into the heavy manila folder. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "What are you going to do?" he asked, watching me with a mixture of respect and concern. "I am going to let them think they have won," I replied, standing up and smoothing out my work jacket. "And then I am going to burn their entire fake world to the ground." I walked out of the investigator's office, the heavy file of truth tucked securely under my arm. I did not drive back to the firehouse. I got straight into my truck, typed a downtown address into my navigation system, and drove directly to the high-rise office of Veronica Hayes. Exactly 48 hours after my meeting with Marcus, a private courier arrived at my job site. He handed me a thin, cheap paper envelope. Inside was a formal legal ultimatum drafted by some discount strip mall attorney my parents had hired. The document was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and legal gaslighting. It threatened to sue me for the financial exploitation of the family if I did not sign over the deed to the firehouse to Morgan within 7 days. They were actually trying to frame me as the parasite, claiming my refusal to help my sister was inflicting intentional emotional and financial distress on the household. I took the letter straight to Veronica Hayes. She read it, her manicured finger tracing the absurd legal jargon, and she did not just laugh this time. Her eyes hardened into obsidian. Wire fraud, forgery of a legal document, identity theft, and embezzlement of a trust fund, Veronica listed, her voice dropping to a dangerous clinical register. These are not just simple civil disputes, Tessa. These are federal felonies. Your parents are looking at serious prison time. I have enough evidence right here in this folder to initiate a brutal discovery process today. But if we file a standard lawsuit now, they will immediately hire defense attorneys, deny everything, and drag this out for years in court while your credit continues to bleed to death. We do not just want to win a lawsuit. We want a complete execution. She leaned across her massive glass desk, tapping the cheap ultimatum letter. To lock this into an airtight, inescapable federal indictment without years of litigation, we need them to confidently walk into their own grave. We need a recorded admission of guilt, or a brazen act of coercion right out in the open, witnessed and documented. The plan we forged in that office was devoid of any familial hesitation. It was pure, calculated warfare. That evening, I sat in the cab of my truck and dialed my mother's number. When she answered, I forced my shoulders to slump, making my voice sound hollow, exhausted, and utterly defeated. "You win," I whispered into the phone, letting a fake tremor slip into my words. "I am tired of fighting. I cannot afford a massive legal battle against my own family. You can have the firehouse. Come over for dinner this Friday night. I will have the final transfer documents printed and ready to sign." My mother let out a sharp, triumphant sigh. "I am glad you are finally being reasonable, Tessa. See? This is what family does. We will be there at 7 o'clock sharp." She hung up without saying goodbye. She thought she had broken me. She had no idea she had just stepped onto a landmine. But a simple legal trap was not enough. I wanted them to lose everything they valued, stripping away the very facade they had destroyed my life to maintain. My father worshipped social status and high-level capital above all else. For the past 6 months, he had been desperately courting Harrison Caldwell, one of the most powerful and respected venture capitalists in the state. Arthur needed a $2 million investment for a new commercial real estate project, and he had been aggressively selling Harrison on his fabricated image as a deeply ethical, family-oriented businessman. What my father did not know was that I had spent the last 2 years overseeing the historic masonry restoration of Harrison Caldwell's private 19th century estate. Harrison was a man who valued absolute integrity, and he respected my quiet, grueling work ethic immensely. I called Harrison directly. I invited him to a private dinner at the firehouse on Friday, casually mentioning that I had a highly lucrative, historically significant property I was preparing to transfer, and that my father would also be attending to discuss family business. Harrison, eager to see my famous firehouse and observe my father in an intimate family setting before signing over millions of dollars, immediately accepted the invitation. For the next 4 days, my home transformed into a hunting blind. I moved with the cold, mechanical precision of a predator preparing a snare. I cleaned the massive open-concept kitchen until the polished concrete floors and marble countertops gleamed immaculately. I prepared a lavish, expensive menu, marinating meats and chopping vegetables with methodical, rhythmic strikes of my chef's knife. More importantly, I wired my own dining room. I purchased 3 high-definition micro-recording cameras. I embedded one securely inside the thick foliage of a potted fern near the arched window. I hid the second one within the intricate ironwork of the antique chandelier hanging directly above the heavy oak dining table. The third went onto the high bookshelf, aimed squarely at the seat I had designated for my father. In my state, it was entirely legal to record a conversation as long as one active participant consented. I was that participant. Every single arrogant word spoken in that room would become irrefutable, digital evidence. Across town, Veronica and her elite team of paralegals worked around the clock. By Thursday afternoon, they had prepared 3 identical, massive leather binders. These were not transfer deeds. They were airtight, fully enclosed litigation files detailing every forged signature, every stolen penny from Aunt Beatrice, and every fraudulent credit line. The chessboard was set. The legal noose was intricately woven, tied, and securely fastened to the heavy timber beams of my home. All my parents had to do was walk through the front door and put their necks inside. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the cavernous, vaulted space of my home. I stood in the foyer for a moment, letting the sound reverberate, taking one final deep breath before pulling the heavy iron handle. I opened the door to find my family standing on the threshold, radiating a sickening aura of unearned triumph and grotesque entitlement. My mother wore a pristine white cashmere coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her chin tilted upward in an arrogant, practiced angle. My father adjusted his expensive silk tie, His chest puffed out with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully bullied his prey into total submission. Morgan stood slightly behind them, tapping her designer stiletto impatiently against the restored stone porch. They did not wait for a polite invitation. They brushed past me and stepped inside. Their eyes immediately began darting around the expansive room. They were no longer viewing my home as a mere architectural project or an industrial eyesore. They were appraising it as their newly conquered asset. Morgan ran her soft, heavily manicured fingers along the edge of my polished oak dining table, a greedy smirk playing on her lips. She looked up at the towering arched windows, then whispered something to my mother. Eleanor simply nodded, her eyes gleaming with a victorious, predatory satisfaction. Exactly 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang a second time. When I opened it and ushered Harrison Caldwell into the great room, the oxygen seemed to instantly vaporize from my parents' lungs. Harrison looked effortlessly dignified in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, exuding the quiet, undeniable power of a man who controlled billions of dollars in investment capital. When my father turned and saw him standing in the foyer, he physically stumbled backward. His eyes went wide with a frantic, desperate confusion. He looked at me, then at Harrison, his mind violently trying to process the collision of his two completely separate worlds. But Arthur was a seasoned predator in the corporate landscape, and it only took him 3 agonizing seconds to recover his composure. His shock dissolved into a blinding, sycophantic grin. He immediately lunged forward, extending both hands to aggressively shake Harrison's. I watched the gears turning in my father's head. He genuinely believed I had orchestrated this entire evening as a grand, subservient gesture to help him secure his $2 million commercial real estate investment. The sheer arrogance of that assumption was almost beautiful to witness. My mother instantly switched into the role of the devoted, elegant matriarch. Her shrill, demanding voice dropped to a smooth, cultured purr as she elegantly offered Harrison a glass of my most expensive vintage red wine, acting as if she were the gracious hostess in her own mansion. We finally sat down at the heavy oak table. The hidden cameras, blinking invisibly from the potted fern, the iron chandelier, and the high bookshelf, silently captured every single movement, every fake smile, and every forced laugh. I served the dinner I had spent hours preparing, moving around the table, pouring wine and serving roasted lamb like a ghost catering to royalty. The air in the room was thick, suffocating beneath the crushing weight of their profound hypocrisy. The contrast between the warm, beautiful sanctuary I had built and the absolute moral rot of the people sitting inside it made my stomach turn. As the main course was cleared and the wine glasses were refilled, my father decided it was time to put on his ultimate performance. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his dark red wine, and cast a warm, sickeningly paternal gaze in my direction. "Harrison," my father began, his voice dripping with practiced theatrical emotion that made my skin crawl, "I am just so incredibly blessed. You see, family is the absolute bedrock of any true success. Tonight is a very special, intimate occasion for us. Tessa here is doing something truly extraordinary." He paused dramatically, placing a hand over his heart, playing the role of the humble patriarch to absolute perfection. She is transferring the deed of this magnificent property over to her sister. We firmly believe it is a beautiful, sacred duty for a child to repay the parents who gave her life, and to support the boundless potential of her sibling. We believe that true success requires shared sacrifice. Tessa is happily stepping aside, liquidating her assets so Morgan can secure the essential capital she needs for her next massive tech venture. It genuinely brings tears to my eyes to witness such pure, selfless sibling devotion. Harrison Caldwell smiled warmly, carefully cutting a piece of his lamb. He looked around the table, his eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "That is remarkably generous, Tessa," Harrison said, raising his glass slightly in my direction. It is incredibly rare to see a family with such strong, unified bonds in today's cutthroat world. Arthur, you must be incredibly proud of the ethical foundation you have built in this household. My father beamed, his face flushing with sickening pride as he absorbed the praise from the billionaire. But Morgan could never let an elegant moment last. Her inherent toxic greed made her horribly impatient, and the wine had already loosened her tongue. She dropped her heavy silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud, jarring clatter. She looked across the table at me, her eyes flashing with a cold, spoiled entitlement that she did not even try to hide from our guest. Yes, it is all very sweet," Morgan sneered, waving her hand dismissively at my father's speech. "But let us get down to actual business. Tessa, grab the legal paperwork and a pen. I need this finalized tonight. My interior designer is booked for next Tuesday, and I already promised him he could bring the sledgehammers. That entire antique brick wall you spent months whining about has to go. It is way too depressing, and I need an open concept layout for my home office." The entire room fell into a sudden, suspended silence. Harrison stopped chewing. He looked slightly taken aback by Morgan's callousness, his brow furrowing just a fraction of an inch as he glanced between the two of us. My mother shot Morgan a vicious, warning glare, terrified the golden child was ruining the perfect illusion they were painting for the investor. My father cleared his throat nervously, forcing a hollow, strained chuckle into the quiet room. "Morgan is just very eager to get to work," my father quickly explained to Harrison, beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He turned his attention back to me, his smile remaining fixed but his eyes tightening into a violent, silent command. "Tessa, sweetheart, bring out the documents. Let us make this official." I did not move. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, my calloused hands resting calmly on the polished wood. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, ticking by second after second until the polite smiles on my parents' faces began to curdle into genuine, creeping unease. I looked directly into my father's eyes, watching the false warmth die. I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was clutching her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Finally, I looked at my sister, whose arrogant smirk was slowly fading into confusion. The obedient, invisible daughter they thought they could crush was dead. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice completely flat, slicing through the tension like a freshly sharpened blade. "And this house, along with everything else you are trying to take, will never belong to you." The moment the words left my mouth, the heavy double doors of the dining room swung wide open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed against the polished concrete floor. Veronica Hayes walked in, looking like an absolute executioner in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Behind her walked a stoic paralegal carrying a massive, combination-locked leather briefcase. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. My father jumped up from his chair, his face twisting in sudden outrage. "Tessa, what is the meaning of this? Who are these people?" Veronica did not even acknowledge his existence. She walked straight to the center of the heavy oak table, standing directly under the iron chandelier. The paralegal set the briefcase down and snapped the brass latches open. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. Veronica pulled out 3 incredibly thick, neatly bound stacks of paper and dropped them onto the table. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice smooth but laced with lethal intent. She turned her icy gaze toward Harrison Caldwell, who was watching the scene unfold with intense, calculated interest. "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Veronica Hayes. I am the legal counsel for Tessa Cruz. I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I believe my client is about to save you from making a $2 million mistake." Arthur turned a sickly shade of gray. "Get out of my daughter's house!" he roared, though his voice shook with a sudden, creeping terror. Veronica ignored him and picked up the first stack of papers. "This," she said, tossing it directly in front of Harrison, "is a fraudulent durable power of attorney. Arthur and Eleanor Cruz forged my client's signature 3 years ago to gain total, unchecked control over her financial identity. She picked up the second stack. This is the complete financial audit of 7 different corporate credit lines and 2 secondary mortgages, entirely maxed out to the tune of over $400,000, all illegally opened in Tessa's name to fund Morgan's failed startup companies. My mother let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Morgan just stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing in pure shock. Veronica picked up the final, thickest binder. And this is the probate record of Beatrice Cruz. 5 years ago, she left a trust fund of exactly $300,000 to Tessa. Arthur and Eleanor intercepted the notice, forged the release documents, and systematically embezzled every single penny to pay for country club memberships and luxury penthouses. Veronica leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. You did not come here tonight to receive a loving gift from a devoted daughter. You came here to extort her into signing over a $500,000 asset because your criminal house of cards is finally collapsing. You intended to liquidate this house to secretly pay off the banks before the federal government realized you stole her identity. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison Caldwell sat perfectly still. He looked at the documents, then slowly raised his eyes to look at my father. The warm, admiring expression Harrison had worn just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. It was replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Arthur," Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you pitched me a commercial partnership based on integrity and family values. You sit at this table and preach about sacrifice, while you are actively robbing your own flesh and blood to cover up federal fraud." Harrison stood up slowly, calmly buttoning his navy suit jacket. "Consider our negotiations permanently terminated. If you ever contact my office again, I will personally ensure every venture capitalist in this state knows exactly what kind of man you are." He turned to me, gave a brief, respectful nod, and strode out of the house. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, echoing like a judge's gavel. The illusion was entirely shattered. My father collapsed back into his chair, his face buried in his hands, breathing in ragged, panicked gasps. My mother broke down into ugly, loud sobs, her elegant facade melting away as she begged me to listen, crying that they only meant to borrow the money, that they were going to pay it back. Morgan, however, suddenly realized the gravity of her own situation. "Wait!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "If Harrison is gone, and we do not get this house, who is paying the rent on my penthouse? What about my business loans? I do not have any money." "You had better start looking for a job, Morgan," I said quietly, looking at her with cold indifference, "because the Bank of Tessa is permanently closed." Veronica tapped her gold pen against the table, drawing their panicked attention back to her. "Here is the reality of your situation," Veronica stated clearly. "Everything you have said tonight has been recorded by 3 hidden cameras placed legally in this room. My office has already prepared a comprehensive evidence package. You have exactly 24 hours to sign a legally binding agreement assuming 100% of the fraudulent debt, and you will sign a promissory note to repay the $300,000 you stole from Beatrice's trust. If you refuse, or if you miss the deadline by a single minute, I will hand-deliver this entire briefcase, along with the video footage, directly to the FBI field office tomorrow morning. You will all face federal indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. You will go to federal prison." Veronica picked up her empty briefcase. "Have a good night. We will expect you at my office tomorrow at 9 in the morning." Several months later, the toxic empire my parents had built was reduced to ashes. Faced with the undeniable threat of federal prison, they signed everything Veronica put in front of them. The sheer weight of the debt instantly crushed them. Their country club memberships were revoked. They were forced to sell their sprawling suburban home at a massive loss just to keep the secondary lenders from pressing criminal charges. The high society friends they had spent their lives trying to impress completely blacklisted them, treating them like a contagious disease. Morgan was unceremoniously evicted from her luxury penthouse. The golden child, stripped of her stolen funding, was forced to take a minimum wage retail job, spending her days folding clothes just to afford a tiny, rundown studio apartment. They were left with nothing but each other, and the suffocating reality of what they had done. I stepped out onto the front porch of the firehouse. The morning air was crisp and completely still. I sat down on the antique brick steps I had painstakingly restored by hand, wrapping my calloused fingers around a hot mug of black coffee. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light across the polished stone walls of my home. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute quiet. I had protected my sanctuary. I had reclaimed my financial freedom. But most importantly, I had finally cleared away the rotting debris of my past, and I had rebuilt my own life. It was a life built on truth, hard work, and unyielding strength. It was solid, and it was entirely unbreakable. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.